Good afternoon, everyone. Today is December 14th, 2021. It's 1:00 p.m. We're here for a meeting of PC54, which is the Community Choice Pilot. The agenda today is, let's see, we have 29 participants on the call right now. Adam Fairbanks, Ashish Mehta, Beverly Sikora, Bill Fields, Bob Reaping, Mr. Woomer, Daria Pugh, David Bloom, David Hoppick, Elizabeth Stroud, Drew McAuliffe, Fran Francis, Jeffrey Trout, Katie Lanzarato, Kevin Carey, Lisa Brennan, Melanie Grant, Misty Renninger, Nancy Cullum, Peter Wilson, Philip Vanderhayden, Robbie Atkins, Robert Brown, Robert Laub, Shan Gordon, Stan Edwards, Taylor Beckham, Valerie Mayoni. Looks like a few others have entered the call since I started the roll. If you would go ahead, if you didn't hear me call your name, please type it in the chat box. For our agenda today, we have several filings. We asked that last week filings be made on the issue of the start date and mechanism for the CCA. We received filings from Ms. McGilvray, Montgomery County staff, and the utilities combined. So we're gonna start with Ms. McGilvray. We'll give the filer the opportunity to tee up their filing if they would like, or to give additional thoughts. And then if you'll go ahead and raise your hand, there's a raise hand function on your screen so that we know someone else may have questions or comments. We can go ahead and go through those. So we'll start with Ms. McGilvray. We'll then go to the utilities, then Montgomery County and staff. And I also wanted to ask if OPC, who has a ton of experience and involvement with the SOS process, if they have any additional questions or comments or suggestions. But we'll go ahead. Ms. McGilvray, do you have anything else that you want to say about your filing?
No, I would be happy to answer any questions if anyone has them. Basically, I'm just putting forward a question about the questions that you've asked, whether or not, or to what degree that's to assist with the SOS process, and how much of it would actually be incorporated into the regulations. And then had suggestions around, at least from my perspective as a Montgomery County resident and electricity consumer, that the county have sufficient flexibility to implement as soon as possible. And then I had some requests of the PSC and other participants of this work group to make the process move as smoothly and quickly as possible. And then finally just suggested some principles that were drawn from and modified from the Boston CCA that may help guide the discussions of this group. So I'll just leave it there, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay, since speaking, while we're waiting for folks to raise their hands, since speaking, I noted that Drew McAuliffe from the Maryland Public Service Commission staff and Alexis Gallagher from PHI are also on the call. The question that you referenced, Ms. McGilvray, is whether or not the commission is looking to draft regs about our decision that we're making now, or if this is simply an opportunity for us to, sorry, I'm trying to turn to the right page. If this is simply an opportunity for us to have no effect on the SOS process, and I can take that one. So when you say the commission, the Maryland Public Service Commission, there is a commission, and they make the final decision in these matters. And when the statute addresses the commission. They address the commission. There's no one from the commission here. I work for the Maryland Public Service Commission. I am from the Public Utility Law Judge Division. I'm a separate entity, for instance, from staff. We have separate duties, separate mandates. Same, much like the Office of People's Counsel, which represents the residential ratepayers. So we need to be careful when we're talking about what the PSC is going to do. We don't control what the Maryland Public Service is going to, the commission itself is going to do. We put filings before them for their decision. Right now, what we're doing has nothing to do with in any way narrowing what the community choice program is going to be. What we're doing right now is we're trying to make our first decision in the SOS, the CCA pilot, and we're doing that now. And it's one of the things that we have to do first, so that there's no adverse effect to the SOS process, or to other ratepayers, for instance, like Prince George's County. So let's see. So that's the answer to the first question. I don't see that anybody has raised their hand. Does anybody have any questions or comments about the filing made by Ms. McGilvray? Okay, again, no raised hands. Does anybody later in the filing, Ms. McGilvray asked that we work to adopt regulations as soon as possible, sooner than December 31st if possible. I can assure you, Ms. McGilvray, that's what we're trying to do in making these decisions. She asked that utilities and third-party suppliers articulate all concerns and issues as early as possible, that PSC staff hold all workgroup members to the expectation of raising issues early, that PSC staff and the workgroup members provide information needed to make decisions in a timely and transparent manner, and that the county's goals related to consumer benefits and protections, greenhouse gas reduction, renewable energy be given equal weight to administrative and logistical issues raised by utilities and third-party suppliers. So does anyone have any objection to those goals?
I'm sorry, it's Kevin Carey from Mayor, but obviously lots of administrative stuff on this. Obviously we want to keep an eye on costs and make sure that people who do not participate in the Montgomery County aggregation plan are not adversely affected by anything with this moving all of SOS rates over to CCA and things like that. Just to be mindful of that cost and who actually bears the brunt of that cost. Again, thinking of members of ours in Prince George's County and also members of ours who do not want to participate in CCA. So just to be mindful of that. Thank you.
This is Taylor Beckham from PHI. Not really an objection, but just want to make sure that, we are on the utility side are doing the best we can to bring up the issues as soon as we hear about them. But as I want to just kind of reserve our rights for the fact that, we also are responding to what we hear throughout the working group. So, and, when different options are presented, we're responding as they come. So we will do our best to, be as forthcoming and as soon as we know, let you all know. But I don't want us to, an expectation to be for us to lay out all of our issues up front, because we just don't know at this point.
Absolutely. Okay, Ms. McGilvray, do you have anything else?
No, and I certainly understand and respect the comments that other workgroup members have made. That certainly makes sense since we're doing something for the first time. So thank you for your time. And with regard to the principles, that's something that we'll continue to talk to the county about, but just wanted to make people aware of the kinds of goals that CCAs such as Boston have put together. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. McGilroy. Thank you for, responding with a written filing and for your comments. Next, we're going to turn to, what did I say? Oh, responding to Ms. McGilroy's filing was Food and Water Watch. Ms. Hawkins, did you have anything to add?
I just would add that we, Food and Water Watch very much supports the comments that Ms. McGilroy made. We also, we worked for several years with a lot of grassroots groups and environmental advocates in Montgomery County, who I know are anxious to see this program become available as soon as possible. We want to make sure that efforts are really being made to start it in a way that obviously is smooth and works well, but also does adhere to the timeline that's laid out by the legislation that passed.
Anyone want to respond to Ms. Hawkins? Okay, thank you, Ms. Hawkins. We'll move on to the utilities. Does someone want to speak for the utilities, or do folks want to start raising their hands for questions based on the filing by the utilities?
Judge Grace, again, this is Taylor Beckham from PHI. I'll just tee up our filing and invite my other utility colleagues to hop in and add some color. But, just the main points that we hit related to the start date and the preferred customer transition. So the utilities would recommend that the CCA commence on October 1st, 2024, with the exception of Potomac Edison, who would recommend that the program commence on or after June 1st, 2025. We have different responses in terms of the transition. We would say for Pepco, because we do have 200,000 customers about, we would need a staged transition over a period of months. And the transition would start as soon as possible after that October 1 date. For PE and BGE, they would prefer a single transition of customers, caveating that transition would occur over several days and not all on the same day to avoid overwhelming their system. So that's the high level, and I'll invite my colleagues to step in and add any more color. Thank you.
Okay, David Havoc, I see that you're.
Yeah, thank you, Judge Grace. So, couple questions related to this for Potomac Edison. Just clarifying on the later start date. So you've asked for on or after June 1st, 2025. Is this because you don't want to adjust any of what is bid in the forthcoming April bid? Is that, can you help understand why June 2025 as opposed, for example, June 2024 or something like that?
That's exactly right,
it's
David.
Bob Reed.
Go ahead, Bob.
Yeah, no, David, it's Bob Reaping. So yeah, what we're looking at is if we're going to make a change and go on June 1 of 2024 for 13%, which would be, a much smaller group as opposed to the Pepco load and the others. We were thinking obviously we'd have to go in and get a change to our approved bid plan, which is part of the current SOS bid cycle. And so in looking at that, we just thought, it might make more sense to just wait till June 1 of 2025 gets us out of this current approved bid cycle we can then address all the issues associated with the SOS process as part of the next full PIP coming up, which will be this summer. And then we don't have to mess with the contract terms at this point. So that was the basic thought of just going with us until June 1 of 2025.
Okay, understood. And then a follow-up question, I think kind of for all the utilities. So if, BGE and Pepco began serving load in October 2024, is, kind of thinking about implementation. So you're no longer bidding, or you're no longer bidding such that contracts are starting October 2024 for the current Montgomery County load. I guess this would more apply to Pepco than BGE. I think BGE, we're talking about on the order of single percent of total SOS load, but just thinking through a little bit more of how the bid process would actually change for an October 2024 start.
Dave, so we're actually, unfortunately, Dan Tudor, who is our SOS guy, he's not able to join us at this moment, but I can ping him and ask him and then follow back up with you on that.
And David Hoppick, this is David Bloom from BGE, and I'm the manager in the BGE's energy acquisition group, which is responsible for the procurement of our standard offer service product. And if I'm understanding your question correctly, is you're asking whether or not conceptually going forward that any period of time when a community choice aggregation or CCA is in effect, that the utilities would, your question I think is, would the utilities be procuring load for those customers who are eligible for the CCA? Do I have your question correct?
So that was kind of my follow-up question, but if we're assuming for and I think it's simpler for Pepco, if we're assuming a October 2024 start for the Pepco service territory, like the October bid that Pepco will do in 2022 goes through, that contract goes through May 2025. So I understand that you're trying to kind of pick logical times when contracts roll off, because the April 2022 bid, those contracts will end at the end of September 2024, but you will be bidding October 2022 for contracts that start June 23. And so presumably you're serving the whole load for, and by Pepco and BGE, serving the whole load for both PG and Montgomery County SOS through September 2024. And then from October, the Montgomery County load begins to not be served by SOS for residential and type 1. So do you have any thoughts on the specific details of that transition within that?
Yeah, let me, instead of trying to put calendar dates, let me first state that I don't know if I agree with the presumption that the utilities would no longer be able to offer or have a process to procure standard offer service for customers in any eligible community choice aggregation area. I don't know if I agree with that presumption. And maybe I am. That's where I'm taking your question. So I don't know if I can. Yeah. Yeah,
Can
so
I
help me.
respond? Yeah, no,
Yeah.
I wasn't trying to make a statement about whether you can or cannot serve SOS to Montgomery County customers. My point was more that there is load that you will be serving up until, say, September 2024 that will start to transfer to the CCA. And for BG, my understanding is the proposal is over a period of days. And then for Pepco, a month or two, I don't know, 3, but you have a period during your contract in which the entire SOS load is served by the contract, and then you start to transition to a period where the CCA is picking up some part of that. So just trying to understand if there are any thoughts on that transition.
Well, so I guess I think you're right that there will be the idea here is that there will be a transition for customers who elect or by default end up in a community choice aggregation program, and whenever that load service begins, that transition would occur. What I'm trying to sort of parse out here is what it seems like is there's an attempt to. I want to make sure we understand the risk mitigation that we're talking about here when it comes to the SOS procurement, and really the value of that risk mitigation is effectively communicating to the participants, the wholesale suppliers in the SOS procurement. And so that's why I know you're bringing up the transition dates, and I know that's why we're talking about that. I think we all agree there that that's really the value here is attempting to effectively communicate to the SOS suppliers when the SOS or when the CCA may be serving SOS customers. And I guess what the idea here with our proposal that, or what the utilities have put here as far as October 1st or June 1st, 2025, is to allow that communication to be most effective to the SOS suppliers. We recognize that that transition is going to have to happen at some point, and by having the transition date start when we've suggested here, it allows for I think the cleanest break in time.
To combine what David and Bob have said, what David Bloom and Bob Reaping have said, David, you are right that we're going to have to address the transition where Montgomery County load falls off, Montgomery County SOS load falls off because the CCA steps in and presumably takes a substantial part of the load. The question is, when and how smoothly can we address that transition in the SOS rules and with the SOS bidders, the suppliers who bid to provide the load? And the point of the utilities proposal of October for BGE and Pepco and June of 2025 for PE is that all of that figuring out of how to address it and all of that communication with the suppliers gets worked out next summer when we're designing the 2022 through 2023 bid cycle, which will include load after the dates you've mentioned, as opposed to having to address it on an emergency basis now by asking the commission to change the duration or make other changes to the contracts and the bidding for the cycle that's already underway. So yes, there's going to have to be a plan, and it's going to need a fair amount of work and a fair amount of thought. But the way to undertake that thought and work in an orderly way and to integrate the work of this work group with the work of the ongoing SOS process improvement process is to have the transition take effect, begin with the 2022 through 2023 cycle and not in the cycle that we're in the middle of now.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you to you both. That was very helpful. Judge Grace, I think you're muted.
Thanks, David. Bill Fields, I think your hand is raised.
Yeah, thanks. Bill Fields with the Office of People's Counsel. A lot of what I was going to say was just covered between David Hoppick and Jeff and some of the other utility folks. If it was, if Montgomery County decided that they, or the commission decided that this wasn't going to start until October 1, 2024, or June of 2025 for PE, then you would still need a plan for how to deal with PEPCO customers on SOS after that date. And that could be, and you'd have to have a plan for both individual customers who opted out of the aggregation, and you'd have to have, and I think you should, we need to consider what's going to happen if the aggregation start gets delayed for some reason. That wouldn't be anybody's plan, obviously, but things happen, and if the aggregation were delayed, we need to have some plan in place for acquiring SOS power after that start date. I think it's helpful to think of this in terms of what we're asking the wholesale suppliers to do at these various procurement points. We've got April, we have one coming up in April of 2022, and we're set to use full requirements contracts with 2-year procurement. I certainly personally am hesitant to make drastic changes to that, or even significant changes, because that's going to impact not just Montgomery County, but it's going to impact customers in other counties. So if we stay on that course, we're asking wholesale suppliers to supply customers starting October 1, 2022 through, for 2 years till September 30th of 2024. And if there's a possibility that significant load is going to leave those contracts during that time period, that's going to raise an issue, a risk for those suppliers, and it's likely going to raise the price. And so I think one way to deal with that is to say that we're not going to, that the aggregation is not going to start before October 1, although, as I think Jeff Trout was saying, that delays the decision or delays the issue until next fall, because at that point you have at that point you need to start to procure load. You're going to enter into contracts that go past October 1, 2024. And we need to think about what we're asking those suppliers to do in October. And either we're going to tell them that they don't have to supply load in Montgomery County, or at all for that contract, or we're going to tell them that the Montgomery County load is definitely leaving at some point, and that's going to mean that they're not going to be on the hook for it after that. I don't see a way to really sort of hedge that and just give them our expectation or something like that. I don't think that really solves the problem. We need to we need to have clear, clear obligations for the wholesale suppliers if we're going to get the pricing that we want. I can, I mean, those are just some of the issues. Oh, the other issue I wanted to bring up at this point, to talk about a transition over days or months, we are going to have to then, I mean, if the transition, for example, goes past October 1, 2024, we're going to have to think about who's supplying what customers, after that. It may work better to do the transition before that date somehow, although that implicates the contracts that are being procured in April. If it's just a few days, that may be sort of de minimis. If it's weeks or months, that maybe it's not, and that's something that has to be factored in as well. So that's the comments I had on the utility proposal.
I agree with the complexities that Bill has pointed out. This is Jeff Trout. And I think that's why the utilities are proposing an approach that gives us until next summer to figure out how to cope with all of those complexities, as opposed to having to make a filing in early January to take to the commission because we have to alter the bidding that's going to take place in this current cycle. Those are all the things Bill pointed to and more are things we're going to have to solve, and that this work group is going to play a critical role in resolving alongside the SOS supplier process. But with the best intentions in the world, we are not going to get those questions answered to everyone's satisfaction or to the maximum amount of consensus, or indeed any consensus between now and the end of the year. Whereas between now and when we have to file the bid plans for the 2022-2023 cycle, which is August of 2022, that's becomes a mission that is not impossible.
Yeah, this is Robbie also for PHI. And Bill, you're making it sound like SOS is going away completely for Montgomery County, and there will be some customers who will opt out of the CCA.
Well, right, that's true. And what I was trying to say is that we need to be, clear about how those customers are being served. And I think, you can probably have a different answer if it's, if we think it's going to be customers who opt out, it's, similar to the level of switching, that kind of thing is one thing. If you have all of the Montgomery County load for a portion of the contract, an unknown duration, that becomes a different issue.
Yeah, this is Kevin from AO, but yeah, this is one of the questions we brought up, and this is a big part of the opt-in versus opt-out. If you think of a residential SOS customer who's going to get a notice in the mail that says, that they may or may not read, that all of a sudden they're going to have switched over to the CCA, I think you're going to see a higher switching than you will with a traditional third-party supplier where the customer had the choice. Now the choice is being made for them just by not reacting to or not answering a direct mail piece of literature. So again, that adds to the complexity of you'll end up with a CCA load and then a completely unknown SOS load, and then what happens if for people switching out of CCA or back to SOS if they didn't realize the switch was made, and all those other complications that we still need to dig through. So.
Stan Edwards, your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. I just have some questions about we're talking about the timing of the start, whether it should start in June or October or later. And it seems to me we should be talking about the auctions. So I would agree that it's too late for a change to the April 22 auction. There's too many decisions, too many unknowns, even for the county, or maybe particularly for the county, to influence that. And so a quarter of the summer load in 24 is going to be bid in that April auction. But I guess I'd like to understand better how that precludes the October 22 auction, the county starting some transition to the CCA in June of 24 and affecting the October 22 auction. It seems to me what I've heard is Pepco in particular would like to transition in October in a staged way. So I infer from that the bidders in that auction are going to have to be told that in October of 24, it might be 75% of the load, and in November or December, it might be 50% of the load. So there's some phasing there that the folks are bidding on. It seems to me that same sort of process could work back starting in the summer, that they could be told that in that portion for the summer, there'll be full load or 70% of load or 50% of load or whatever the transition is. So I guess I'd like to understand a little bit better about why the decision to not impact the April auction automatically locks us into not starting prior to October 24.
Stan, this is David Bloom with BGE, and let me see if I can address your question. And let me first make sure it's clear to everyone that the auction procurement cycle ultimately leads to a single SOS rate. And so it's the blending of all of the contracts that get procured over time, and the customers then ultimately pay that their relevant rate classes SOS rate. Stan, does that make sense, what I just described?
Absolutely. Yep.
Okay. And so when we begin to affect portions of any term, you start to get the risk that we're all having to accept here of the unknown start date for the CCA, and how much load is ultimately going to move away from the CCA. And so you end up in putting aside attempting to address any kind of communication on start date, but you end up having intra-term price discrepancies by the suppliers that can be managed by moving the start date as we've proposed. It allows for essentially a uniform pricing structure by the suppliers during the SOS term.
Well, David, let me see if I can just ask a question about that. So what I understood, and maybe I misunderstood, Pepco suggesting, I know you're not with Pepco, but Pepco suggesting that they don't want to transfer all their customers at once. They would like a phasing in. So I assume that means, I'm just making this up, a third 1 month, a third the next month, and a third the next month. That sort of phasing in. So I assume what the SOS bidders are going to be told is, here's going to be so a certain percentage of the total SOS comes from Montgomery County. And in the first portion, this first month, you're going to have 2/3 of the Montgomery County load. And in the second month, you're going to have 1/3 of the Montgomery County load. And by the third month, there will be no more Montgomery County load. So bid accordingly. I assume they're bidding based on historical usage in Montgomery County. And so that gives them the idea of what load they're bidding for. And so if that's correct, and if not, please let me know. If that's correct. It seems like that same process could work backwards. In other words, it could start in June. Just because we're saying we're not going to affect the April auction, by the time we get to the October auction, we could say, here's what the transition schedule is going to be. I'm not suggesting we have an unknown transition schedule. I'm suggesting we have a known transition schedule, but it may be earlier than October. What I'm saying is it doesn't seem to me there's any reason to right now lock in October. We have to make the decision that we're not affecting April. I get that. And I think we've made that. I mean, the county has agreed to that. But I don't see how that affects the October auction. And therefore gives us a little more time to figure out the transition, which the county is anxious to do as soon as we can. Now, whether we'll be ready or not, I don't know, but we'll have a better idea about whether we're ready or not as the year goes on, as we develop the regulations more.
And I'm going to maybe turn it over to Potomac Edison or someone else from PHI in a moment, but I just want to really emphasize the fact that we are accepting the risk here is in what you just described. Let's take it for what it is. You've established an acceptance of a certain level of cost impact to SOS from uncertainty by the SOS suppliers in either way. I think that's well, clear in what you've described, and we're
no, I haven't.
Yeah, sorry.
I haven't said anything different than what PEPCO said. Did I mischaracterize what PEPCO said about the transition?
Yeah, no, yes, thank you. Exactly. That's our I think our something we want to make sure is clear is that there is inherent risk in either one of these kinds of proposals. That's attempting to try to manage that risk is what we're here to do, I think, and trying to minimize it as best we can. And that's why the utilities are offering the structure to look a certain way.
Yeah, and I agree. We're all trying to manage the risk, which was created by the passage of this law. So we're all of us are dealing with the passage law, which the county supported. I'm not absolving us of the our role here. But what I'm saying is the risk. It doesn't seem to me the risk is any different starting on October 1 and transitioning, October 1, 24 and transitioning over a period of time, or starting on June 1, 24 and transitioning over a period of time. The risk is the same.
So Stan, this is Taylor from PHI. Sorry, I don't know if I could just cut someone off, but I just want to say again, we don't have Dan Tudor here, who is very much so more well-versed in this than I, but I don't think that, I want to make sure that it's clear that PEPCO is not saying that transitioning customers in June 1, 2024 is the same as transitioning customers in October 1, 2024. It is PEPCO's stance that the transitions start October 1st, 2024. And for PEPCO, because we have the most customers, I just don't believe that we'd be able to actually transition every customer all on one day. And being mindful of that, that's why we propose months. Now, I don't know if it's a month. I don't know if it's 2 months. That I'd have to go back to my experts and figure out. But, I unfortunately probably cannot articulate exactly why the October 1 start date from a technical standpoint is the best, but I just want to make sure that we're clear that we don't believe that it's the same to start on June 1st than October 1st.
Yeah, Taylor, I appreciate that. That's my question: is why is it not the same?
This is
cycles.
This is Bill Fields. Let me. I'd like to jump in. If we talk about a transition like you're talking about, Stan, before October 1, 2024, then and part of what you're saying is that we tell the suppliers that here's the schedule that Montgomery County customers are leaving for the CCA. What we'd have to figure out to go along with that is whose responsibility is it if that doesn't happen?
Isn't that true at any point, Bill?
No. Well, at any part the CCA leaves, yeah, I think that's true whenever the schedule is set.
Yeah.
Even if we said, it's leaving October 1,
Right.
there's a possibility that it doesn't happen October 1, and you have the question of who's on the hook after that.
Yeah. So
And
that's
so
all I'm saying is that's present at any time. So
that
I accept that. Yep.
there's an issue there. Yeah. So we would have to work at, you'd have to work out the contractual obligations to deal with you're telling the suppliers, well, this load is going to leave in order to relieve them of the risk. Then that risk has to go somewhere else through definitive obligations that somebody else is going to serve. If the transfer doesn't happen on those dates, then somebody else besides the wholesale supplier has to serve the load.
Yeah.
And the rates are going to they're going to reflect that.
Right.
And
Understood. But that's
insulating and figure out a way to insulate Prince George's County from that.
right, Bill. But I understand that. But that's true if we transition in 2027 or 2029. No matter when the transition occurs,
Well,
there's that risk. So.
well, hey guys, this is Bob Reaping. Let me try just slightly different here. So think about it this way, Stan. What we're trying to do with the date is to create a bright line. So let me give you an example. Let's say that, as we've talked about, we have 15 tranches of residential. Let's say I would have already procured for a time frame, and just make up whatever the time frame is. Like you said, 2027, 2025, 2024, 2023, whatever. Let's say I'd already procured half of the load for a time that you want to transition over. Those wholesale suppliers would have offered a price based on a set of facts that were known on the product. And then half are going to get an opportunity to set a price on a new set of rules. That is going to create uncertainty in the product in Maryland, which then could drive suppliers away, or there could be concerns that there was issues with equity in the way the bids are done. By setting a bright line at a time where we haven't procured any blocks of power yet, and creating a little time, as Mr. Trout and others talked about earlier, to get the rules right so that the wholesale suppliers are aware what the potential is, how the load's going to be served, how it's going to be looked at. That creates certainty. The more certainty we create, the better the opportunity to reduce the risk premiums. So the bright line test is, when we're talking about Potomac Edison, I don't want to speak for the Exelon company, it's on there October 1. But the reason we suggested the June 1 of 2025, that way it doesn't impact the current bid cycle that's already started. The rules are already approved by the commission. The tranches are already approved. It gives us time as a group here to work through all the issues we're talking about and come up with a plan that we can share with the wholesale suppliers, the retail suppliers, all the stakeholders, to make sure that we got all the bases covered, and then we are able to provide a product to all customers in the state that makes sense and won't impact them, that the CCA is happening, or you guys, and you have time to do what you all have to do. So that when you think about those dates we laid out, it's a bright line test that minimizes the impact to the overall process. That's what we're looking to achieve.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm suggesting, thank you, Bob. What I'm suggesting is a bright line as well. It's just a different bright line that may not need to be determined right now. It could be determined at a point before the October, and I apologize, I'm focused on Pepco. Before the October bid of the SOS suppliers, understanding that they've already procured a quarter of the summer load in the April 22 auction. So then we have to say, okay, a quarter's already been procured, and maybe this is a nuance you were getting at, Bob, a little bit that I don't fully understand, but they procured a quarter of the load. So what would they have to what addition would have to be procured in summer if we were to start to transition some customers in summer of 24 in the October auction. It would be a lesser amount if we started transition some customers. It wouldn't be a full quarter. And then in the April 23rd auction, it might be, we could split it out evenly so that it was equal across the October, April, and October 23 auctions. But I think the same process is going to be required to do the transition that I understand Pepco was suggesting, starting October 1, 24, but phasing people in. And I heard Taylor say she doesn't know it's a month or 2 months. I appreciate that, but there's some transition period there, and the suppliers are going to have to be told, again, bright line, what that transition period is so they can bid on it. So I'm just suggesting we don't need to make a decision right now on the 22 auction. We agree that the April 22 auction it's too late to affect that. But I guess I'm just asking, why is it too late to affect the October 22 auction, which gives, again, all of us, the county, the utilities, the supply, everybody, the chance to discuss these issues more, fully understand the ramifications, and then at a later time make that decision.
Dan, I think, and I could be wrong, but what's on the screen right now shows why October 24 is our bright line. So the April 22 bid, and I know staff prepared this, but I think what's on the screen right now shows that the April 22 bid, in order to not affect that bid, we have to go out to October 1, 2024.
Right. So in other words, you're procuring a quarter of the summer load in April 22.
Judge Grace, if you could maybe, I don't know if you're controlling the screen, could you scroll just to the left a little bit there? Yeah, so if I'm reading this spreadsheet correctly, the red X's are what we're procuring for this April 22 bid.
Yep.
And that's out to the end of September 24. So up to September 30, 2024. So our bright line, in order to not affect that April 22 bid, which everyone seems to agree we're not going to do, we got to start October 1 at the earliest.
Okay, but what I'm saying is, in that April 22 bid, you're procuring a quarter of that summer load, right? And then in October 22, if the CCA weren't here, in October 22, you'd procure another quarter. In April 23rd, you'd procure another quarter. And in June 21, you'd procure, I'm sorry, now I'm into PE. But you'd prefer, in these you'd prefer a quarter at a time. You'd procure a quarter at a time. And what I'm suggesting is, the April bid, you procure the quarter. And then when the October bid comes, we've been able to make some decisions. And it turns out we can transition some customers away in June. Not all of them, perhaps, because you've already procured a quarter. So we got to make sure that supply is utilized. And we can set the bright line again, so a third of the customer. And again, I guess I need some help understanding what Pepco's proposing, because you're proposing to do exactly this, to do this transition such that you have to tell the suppliers, again, to Bob Reaping's point, bright lines, but it's not going to be the full Montgomery County SOS load after October 1. It's going to go in pieces, because you've said you don't want to do the transition all at once.
The October 22 bid, I think we know that we're going to have to rework that one. I mean, again, I'm looking at this chart that in order to not affect the April 22 bid, we have to bid through for load through the end of September 30th, 2024. Even though, yes, I get your point that last bit of load is from June to September, and that's just for the summer, but it's still bid out then, right? And we don't want to have the position. We're not trying to affect the April 22 bid and have to tell our suppliers you may have load drop off beginning June 24.
I'm not. Yeah, and I'm suggesting you wouldn't need to do that, because all you're procuring is a quarter of the load, which you could fully utilize.
Well, no, the way that the contracts don't work that way. The way the
Right.
contracts work is each supplier is supplying a percentage. It may just be like 3 or 4 or 5% or maybe more of the total SOS load. So you're not just procuring, a number of megawatt hours or, for certain customers or something like that. You're just each supplier is responsible for a certain percentage of the load. So if a quarter of the Montgomery County customers left in July of 2024, that would mean that each supplier who was supplying load during that summer to Pepco SOS, each of their obligations would go down, a quarter, a half of a quarter, something like that. It would because Montgomery County is about half, and if you're taking away a quarter, each supplier's obligation would go down that much for that summer, which would reduce the risk. That's less risk than if all of them left, but it still has the risk there for all of those suppliers. You just the way the contracts are set up, there's no way to say that we're gonna, some Montgomery County customers are gonna leave and we're gonna shift that SOS supply to these other customers. The contracts would have to be rewritten to try to do that. And I don't know that that's even possible if the suppliers were agreeable.
Yeah.
But they just don't work that way.
I guess I'm not fully following that, Bill, but
When we have a contract, say, we know that we're putting out a bid for 25% of the load, and say the load is 100 total, so we're putting out 25 megawatts. That gets spread across a bunch of suppliers, let's say 5. They each have an obligation to provide the 5 every day during that 2-year time period of the contract. It's not like then we can say, oh, well, no, some of these customers aren't going to be on SOS, so we don't need it as much, and so now we can kind of shimmy it around.
but you've only procured a quarter of the necessary load, right?
No, you've procured you've procured about 25% from these suppliers, but it's that percentage for every single kilowatt hour that is used in SOS.
Right.
And
so
what happens if SOS load goes down because some of Montgomery County leaves, every supplier's obligation automatically goes down correspondingly. And so it just goes away. There's no, you don't have any extra you can shift. I mean, it just goes, the obligation for the supplier's obligation just would instantly go away when half of the Montgomery County customers left. Their obligation would be gone, and they would be supplying less at that at the price they bid, and because of that, that could put the wholesale supplier in a good position or a bad position, depending on what the wholesale prices were at the time. And that's the risk that we're talking about.
So how's that going to work at the transition if we do October transition and transition over a period of time?
Yeah, I agree with you there. It creates a problem, because if you can't transition all on October 1st, and you say, well, we're gonna do some October 1st and some October 8th and some October 15th or whatever, then somebody has got to be on the hook to supply whatever's still there in Montgomery County after that. And yeah, that's gonna put an obligation on those customers. And if it's done the same way that SOS is done now, that's gonna put a risk on those suppliers, which could impact the price that the remaining SOS customers pay. So I definitely agree with you that that's a problem that needs to be figured out.
And I
Right,
think
and Bill,
go ahead.
you hit the nail on the head. That's exactly right. So you want all suppliers who are going to be serving across a term to understand the risk of the product they're entering into. The more certainty we have in developing this product and how we're going to handle this going forward, the more information, the better. So going back to Stan's question, you keep saying, well, what's the issue with transitioning 25% after the fact? Well, if you bid out 25% under the current rules, and those suppliers don't know what the future obligation is going to be, and what I mean by that, the rules associated with how it's going to be, are they going to wear the risk of those customers? Is the current ink deck process going to work? Is that load going to be served some other way? The more unknowns we create for them, the more risk premium that gets created, and may not be placed on Montgomery County customers. It may be if your transition date goes later, or it may fall to all the other SOS customers. The bright line in giving ourselves a few extra months to get these details in place helps eliminate that. So when you say there's no big deal, and I'm putting words in your mouth, and I don't think you said there's no big deal, you're saying you didn't understand why that 25% is important. The 25% is important because unless PHI and BG&E truncate their product to get rid of that summer period, but they go ahead and bid it in April, those suppliers are going to have greater unknowns because this process will not be complete yet. And, you know, unless we're going to be able to complete it in the next 3 weeks and file something with the commission, which I think we all recognize isn't happening, now you create additional risk premiums which drive up the price. So just delaying it a couple months to start and creating the bright line in October of 2024 gives us between now and the end of the summer, when we have to file that next bid plan that takes those bid blocks into account, and we're able to definitively figure out how this is going to be. The suppliers will have all the information available, which should help them formulate the right price and not bid into this blind. Or they may not bid at all, which is even worse. If we impact the amount of suppliers that we have interested in this load because there's too many uncertainties, less competition normally creates higher pricing. So we're just trying to throw some ideas out there, you know, to help create an orderly transition, but not impact the customers who will not be part of that transition. Does that help?
Well, first of all, let me just say that I've said on a number of occasions, it's not Montgomery County's desire to negatively affect other people. So we all are on the same page on that. I think we have a shared goal there. Because some of these customers, as people point out, are going to be Montgomery County customers that stay on SOS. So it's not our desire to harm them or Prince George's County. So let me just be clear about that. Yeah, I think I obviously I still need some education on this SOS process. I'm not fully convinced, but I'm not the one that needs to be convinced. So.
This is Bill Fields. I want to talk a little bit about the upcoming April auction. I mean, I think I agree with what the utilities have said in that if we do, if we do say for sure that the CCA is not going to happen before October 1, 2024, or June of 2025 for Potomac Edison. I mean, if we say that, and the commission approves that, then I think you have dealt with the issue for April. But if we can't come to that resolution, and there's still a possibility of it happening before then, we are going to impact that auction. And I think we need to work on, if we're not going to agree on starting October 1 or later, then I think we need to work on that issue some. And we've been working on a couple thoughts. We weren't able to get them together in time to circulate to the group, but they're relatively straightforward ideas. And I can just describe them briefly. One is that when this April procurement happens, that you're procuring, that the wholesale supplier's obligation is going to be for the utility SOS customers plus a certain percentage of the CCA load, which would mean that the CCA, 25, that 25% was already procured by the CCA. That may not be ideal for the CCA because they want to supply all of their load, but for a transition period, some of their load would be already procured under these contracts. There'd have to be a commercial, there'd have to be rules set up for how the CCA pays the utility for that load. But I think that's all doable. And then that would, assuming that we just did it this once, that 25% would last until September 30, 2024, and then that would be the end of it. During that time, the CCA could buy RECs and provide a green product if they wanted, combine it with that supply from the utility, and do what they wanted to do there. That's one possibility. Another possibility is to split at least for PEPCO. I'm not sure either of these make sense for BGE or I'm pretty sure not for BGE, but maybe whether it makes sense for PE or not, I'm not sure. But for PEPCO at least, split the SOS procurement between Montgomery County and Prince George's County. That would, so that the wholesale suppliers would only be obligated for one or the other. That would reduce the number of blocks. Well, it wouldn't reduce the number of blocks for the entire procurement because you're still procuring all the load in April. It would just split it up into two separate products. So that would be something that obviously we want to talk to the wholesale suppliers about. You'd have to do this through some kind of a PIP process in January, February timeframe. I think that could be, the utilities would have to establish two different rate classes in some way. So those are two. Again, if we're not going to definitively say that this is not starting before the dates that the utility brought up, I think those are two ideas, and I can send something around in writing shortly to briefly describe that. just didn't have it. We just weren't able to settle on these ideas, in time before this meeting. But those are two possibilities of what could be done. And I don't think it would be, it's not completely changing the April procurement. It is making some changes that would have to be approved by the commission. But I think it's less less dramatic than shortening the procurement or the duration of the contracts or something else like that. It would be a little more easier to do. So anyway, I mean, those are, like I said, I can send something around in writing shortly on that. Those are two ideas. We definitely want to hear what the utilities think about it once they've absorbed the ideas, or maybe they've thought about them as well. Staff hasn't talked yet. Maybe they've thought about some of those ideas. But I wanted to at least put them out there for discussion. And of course, what Montgomery County would think about that.
Thank you, Bill. Phil, you have your hand raised. Although it's been raised for some time.
Yeah, I did have a couple of questions for the utility folks on their proposal here, if I can ask those now. Let me just getting to the first question, where we're sort of talking about the transition occurring after October 1. Reflecting BG&E only, is that something where that is subject to the same conditions that the PHI and the Potomac Edison start date would be reflected?
Phil, good afternoon. This is David Bloom with BGE. Are you asking as far as the process for transitioning customers from their current supplier to the community choice aggregation, how long that'll take? I may not have understood your question.
No. So we've been looking at the numbers, and I think reached the conclusion that because PG&E was dealing with a much smaller proportion of customers impacted, that we were not proposing at this point, without further understanding of the issue, any changes to the BG&E bid process. So customers within Montgomery County's BG&E territory could effectively switch without impacting the current increment-decrement function within SOS. Is that a bad assumption, or is there some other reason that BG&E would have to start October 1 instead of earlier?
So first, and this is David Bloom again with BG. So first, the assessment of the amount of load, I think, is correct in terms of, given the size of our SOS total and the amount of eligible Montgomery County customers, that the triggering of an anchor deck would be, because of the size, would not likely happen. But then to sort of, I think, answer your question, we're still aligned with PHI's the intent of their to moving it to October 1st, 2024 start date. I think it's, as Bob Reaping was describing from Potomac Edison, it's essentially the same concept that I think that we support as well.
Okay, but I'm just trying to. We were operating under the assumption that BG&E had there is no appreciable risk to the SOS bid pricing that would be seen by SOS bidders if it were known to them that 10,000 or so customers in the BG&E service territory would be subject to transition at some point within 2024. That's all. We were just trying to. We were basically not attempting to set any conditions regarding PG&E start date relating to SOS bidding risks.
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, the anchor deck, because of the size, would not likely be triggered. As far as the way SOS suppliers in general view this, I would probably defer to them in terms of how much risk they're going to put in there, even in BG's service territory. So I can't say there's not going to be any risk, but there will be some. But I think you're thinking about it in generally the right direction.
Okay. That's helpful. I appreciate that. I just wanted to make sure we were not sort of going outside of bounds there. The second question I had relative to the first answer for starting October 1 and in June of 2025. Is this, let me see if I can sort of capture that. How much more do you have you worked out about how the transition would occur October 1? I mean, I definitely understand. I think we also see that, well, it would be nice if, folks agreed on starting October 1, and we could move forward with that, sort of get that, made official. We would have a lot more time to deal with this. But can you tell us, for all of the utilities that are behind that response, is there any further discussion about what would actually change in the bidding cycles after October 1? Or is it, how much more is behind what, would actually happen to the bid process that you can share with us if we wait until, July of 22 to go through the normal procurement improvement process to sort of work this out?
Hey, Phil, it's Bob Briefing. I personally, I don't have those answers yet. That's kind of what we're hoping to work through as part of this group to talk about items and to give ourselves some time to be creative. So that when we get to the summer, we have a really nice, fully developed outline to take into the PIP. I personally would hope that we wouldn't even wait till the summer to start getting the wholesale suppliers engaged so that we can run the traps well ahead of time when Lloyd has to make the filing with the commission in August, so that process is ready to go. One of my fears, though, is that, we've had a very solid process that has worked well on behalf of the customers of Maryland, that we developed back in 2002. I'm just very fearful if we, unintentionally make a knee-jerk reaction at this time that we create more problems for ourselves than what we don't have to by just taking the necessary time, setting that bright line out into the future, and taking the next few months to really get a solid plan put together. But I don't have all the answers right now. That's kind of what this group is here to do, and to further discussions over the next couple months. I'll open up to my utility peers also, but I'm not aware that I've heard any additional detail from anybody else at this point.
Yeah, I echo Bob's points. This is Taylor Beckham from PHI, and certainly folks jump in, other utilities people. I think we are still trying to, this is still just topic one, and it's the first topic, of course, that we need to be focusing on, but there are still so many other aspects to this that we have to work through. I think it's hard for us to even start having these further conversations without, everything. We're trying to really just understand how this whole process is going to work, and that the further conversations that we're going to be having, I think, would better inform that answer. So that's just what I would add.
Okay, I understand. So I mean, it would be fair to sort of describe like where you are in terms of kind of further planning is you're proposing that we delay and take the time to work this out through the standard PIP process. But at this point, there's no game plan for what that, what might be proposed and that's still something that you would like to develop over the next, first half of 2022.
Yeah, Phil, it's Bob again. I'd say that's generally correct, but again, I'm also saying that we don't want to wait too long. As we all know, time flies. So I would even posture to say the first quarter of 2022, we should if we're all doing our jobs on this call, have a pretty good idea what we think is a reasonable proposal to start spreading out to the other interested stakeholders and to get the input and put the best plan together that we can.
Okay. Okay. I appreciate that. On the second question, I just wanted to maybe get some clarification there. It looks like, there are 2 paragraphs in your response that I'm looking at in question 2. What is the preferred customer transition option? So the first talks about PEPCO, where you're talking about transferring about 200,000 customers over a period of months. And that would be a transition over a period of time. But BG and PE are both agreeable to transitioning sort of on a single point, perhaps over a few days, in order to manage the capacity enrollment in the EDI systems. So how much can you tell us at this point? I don't know if this is a question that maybe Robbie can answer or something. What's the maximum number of accounts that can be enrolled in the PEPCO system on a given day?
We can handle 5,000 per day. So it'd be 10 batches of 500.
10 batches of 500. So
5,000 per day.
Okay.
Anything more than that will have a severe impact to our system.
And that's utilizing sort of the standard enrollment. And does that mean that if we were to, how many days do we need? Is that like 40 days or something to get 200,000? That's assuming that you have no other enrollments occurring, or?
No, that's including other enrollments. So it's 5,000 per day. Was that like 20,000 per week? So over roughly 2 months plus a little bit to transition all 200,000 customers.
Okay. So and that implies, and without, I don't know, and I know we have a couple of meetings scheduled in January to actually go over the ins and outs of this. I hate to think that, and maybe 2 months isn't really all that long, depending on which months that occurs. So maybe this really isn't an issue if it takes that long, and maybe there's something that can be worked out to manage the SOS risk over that period of time. So you're basically using the existing process. Have you given any thought to sort of developing some sort of a batch process that would allow you to move a little bit faster?
At this point, no, because we're in the process of also transitioning from ATMS to our new provider as well. So we really can't add too much more to ATMS.
Okay, and the new provider, that's the one where you're sort of shifting. Is that more like away from servers, on site, to more of a cloud-based approach?
Correct.
Does that by any chance come with an increased switching capacity?
I think this will take place before we switch over to the new one.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well,
I'm sorry, Phil. This is Bill again. Could Robbie? Could you just talk a little bit more about what the issue is with your system? I mean, it's a pretty small. 5,000 is a pretty small percentage of your customers.
Yeah. Keep in mind though, it's not just for CCA. We have other suppliers also who are sending in enrollments per day as well, plus other transactions that go out for payments, invoices coming in, things going out. So it's not just for enrollment purposes, but that would be the least impact to our system.
And what would the impact be? I mean, what's limiting it?
What do you mean, what was limiting it? It's,
I mean, why can't, what is the limiting factor? I guess I'm trying to understand.
that part I do not know. I know this is what we've always done, even when we do, say, for example, we do a book of transfer customers. We always have to limit the amount of enrollments that are coming in for that purpose as well, so that it will not either slow up or shut down our system.
So in Pepco's response, when it says it would be a customer transition over a period of months, we're not talking about dividing up customers by zip code or by, small business. What we're talking about is it's conceptually it's one transfer at a time, but just going at the speed that the system can handle. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. Like I said, it'd be 10 batches per day spread out over the day of 500 in each batch. But again, no more than 5,000. I think that's the same also for BG&E. We share the same EDI provider, so it's no more than 5 transactions per day.
Phil, I know that we're still on your questions, but I see that Lori McGilvray and Lisa Brennan have both raised their hands. Is this an okay time to let them butt in?
Go ahead.
Thanks. Are either of your questions appropriate at this time, Ms. McGilvray or Ms. Brennan?
I think so. It's still on the utilities response, maybe a little different from what we were discussing. This is Lori McGilvray. My question is really to Potomac Edison, but the whole group. I am concerned about having a bright line for Potomac Edison that's so different from the rest of the CCA customers of being June 2025. So my question is, if it were possible to set it up, could the CCA offer the opportunity for customers to opt into the CCA just as they could to any third-party supplier in the period after October of 2024, but before June 1, 2025?
You're asking, would we be able to do it the same way that suppliers do it now?
Yeah, just
yeah, we could. I mean, there's no reason that our system couldn't operate that way.
So that could offer a little bit of a equity mitigation, that if the CCA is offering a particularly good rate that is attractive to all Montgomery County eligible customers, that the Potomac Edison group would not be disadvantaged by having those people have to wait another 7 months past when everyone else was able to make the change into the CCA. So I'm just simply saying, could that be
let me offer this
option?
caveat though. Now this would have to still suit all of the rest of our whole operating process. I mean, simply from an EDI standpoint, could it operate? I don't mean would it fit with the rest of our process. I'm simply speaking from an EDI standpoint. Could it be done?
Okay, but if it can be done for any third-party supplier, if it were possible to make the CCA like a third-party supplier on an opt-in basis from October to June, and then it would shift to an opt-out basis for anyone who hadn't opted in. I'm just kind of seeing if that might be an option here.
Sorry, I spoke too soon. That was not from the load standpoint.
Yeah, so this is Bob Briefing. I understand your question. I mean, I think it's a good idea to explore, reasonable idea. We just need to make sure this group, we think through that to make sure that theoretically it's not causing some other issues that we're just not foreseeing. But yeah, Misty, like she said, she from a EDI perspective, it can be set up that way. I just think from a overall holistic process perspective, we just need to think through it before we commit to anything.
Is there anyone from Potomac Edison that can talk about what your daily enrollment capacity is?
Yeah, I think Misty, you have those numbers, don't you? If I'm not
Yeah.
putting you on the spot inappropriately.
No, that's okay. Sorry, I'm used to speaking from an EDI standpoint. That's why I jumped in before Bob had a chance on that last one. For the enrollment, we can do 10,000. Now, bearing in mind that we do have other things happening at the same time, so we would still prefer to curb that if possible. We have to keep in mind that it's 10,000 per day. That's the letters going out are what restrict us. So we've got outbound letters that are going to be affected. So it's more of a bill print impact for us.
And that would give you, what, about 3 days to actually complete the
Yeah,
30,000?
we're looking at about across the 3-day point, and that's barring anything else that's going on at that time.
Okay. How many of PHIs could you do for them? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I was going to say about 0.
All right. The only other question I had, if Ms. McGilvray and was there another, Jen, was there another person that had a question?
Just go ahead with your question, Phil, and then I'll ask Ms. Brennan.
Okay. Maybe this is just a question that gets to the PE bid process. There are some and PE's residential bids are a little bit different in that I think you're bidding 1-year contracts at some point rather than a full 2-year contract like the others. Is that correct?
We bid a combination, Phil, of 12 and 24-month products.
Okay. So one of the things that I think we were looking at, and I apologize, our proposal when it gets into it was sort of Pepco centric because there were some more intricacies with the PE bid process because of sort of the more a little more complication there with the dates and the lengths. But in the April 22 bid, I think we identified that there were a couple of bids that will be a 1-year contract that actually doesn't start until like the following year. And so I think built into the staff proposal was something that would simply, I say simply, but it would propose to move the dates when those contracts would be bid to the next tranche. So I forget if that was April to October or October to the following April or something of that nature. We were looking at the situation where shifting the schedule, even though it's already approved, to when those contracts would be bid would be a way to mitigate any risk to or some of the risk anyway that the wholesale bidders might see and cause them to react with a premium in their price. Do you have a reaction to that? The idea that rather than making changes to like the lengths and that sort of thing, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit when we go over the staff proposal, but simply bidding not in April but in October, so that you're sort of concentrating more of the bidding into a tranche by shifting it later. But does that have the same type of risk, or can you talk about the concerns you might have with doing that?
Yeah, sure. So we actually have 2 bid cycles come up. If you remember, we bid out residential load 4 times a year, unlike PHI and BG&E that only do it 2 times a year. And we have a combination of 12 and 24-month products. So we have bids coming up in both April and June of this year that are part of the currently approved bid schedule. When looking at that, you have 2 choices of how you want to handle it to try to mitigate the exposure of this unknown that we're all currently working on. One, you just leave what's currently approved and part of the product that's known to the suppliers alone, and you move us out to June 1 of 2025. If the group doesn't like that and we feel there's a better way to do it, then the other way you'd have to look at it, Phil, we'd have to go in and truncate the 24-month products that have already been approved and make them 12-month products. That way we could start June 1 of 2024. But you then bring up another really good point that now we are concentrating more load closer to the delivery time as part of the bid window. So, you know, we're throwing more load into the bid process at a future date. And we've, over the years, tried to keep that bid structure in such a way that we have a nice, what I like to call dollar cost averaging. You know, you never going to hit the highs, never going to hit the lows. As long as we're buying product at equal stages, then you're not overly weighting any one particular time or point in time that could impact the SOS rate. So those are kind of the trade-offs you have by truncating the product versus just letting it go as is and then setting your bright line a couple months later than what you can do otherwise.
Okay, and I think you mentioned that you already have, so you've already bid, maybe this was in October of 21, you've already bid a 24-month contract that will go past June 1 of 24 and end in September of 24?
No, I'm sorry, Phil. No, what I was saying, the contracts that we're talking about that would go past June 1 of 2024 will be bid in this coming April and the following in this upcoming June's procurement cycles.
Okay, so conceivably, in addition to moving some of the 12-month products to a later bid, you would either bid a shorter amount so that you weren't running over the transition period, or you would also have to shift some of those 24-month contracts.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is based on what your premise is, and as I read your proposal, we wouldn't have to move any of our current 12-month products. We'd have to truncate the 24-month products and turn them into 12-month products.
I see. Okay, and that, but I was, so I thought maybe, I thought we had identified this by looking at the bid schedules, but so what you're saying is, to the extent that we were doing anything to start June of 24, we need to deal with the April of 22 bid process, which I think we understood that's also the if we go June 24, that's the same problem with PEPCO. Okay, no, I think that answered my question. Thank you, Judge Grace. That's all I had.
Ms. Brennan?
Thank you, Judge Grace. Yeah, I had a follow-up question to what Phil was talking about with specifically with BGE. So I just want to make sure I'm understanding if there's any appreciable risk for BGE to starting June 24. So here's what I'm putting out there strictly for conversational purposes is, could BGE start in June of 24? Where PEPCO starts phasing in beginning in October of 2024, with Potomac Edison transitioning in June of 2025. I'm just asking if that transition schedule allows for less risk, given that it sounds like BGE is going to be such a small number that there's really no appreciable risk to starting in June of 2024. Am I getting that correct, BGE?
Yeah, this is David Bloom with BGE, and so for the amount of there's risk consistent with the size of load that's going to be impacted. That if that's your observation, that's correct. The point here though is that the utility's aim here is to identify ways we can address the risk, and what we've presented is in our view on a way to help reduce the risk overall. Moving the contract or the CCA term to before October 1st would increase the risk versus moving it to after October 1st, 2024. The size of that is a function of way wholesale suppliers are going to participate, but it is a risk.
So I thought there was a discussion about, there was just it was a small enough number that it wouldn't trigger the increment decrement.
That is true, yes. But the way that suppliers then perceive the timing here that is the risk that we're talking about. That's the risk that we're talking about generally here. That's where you begin to build up risks as versus what the utilities have proposed is a way to help manage those risks.
Thank you. So my other question was actually about Bill Field's suggestion that there were two possibilities that he put out there, and I had a question about it, but I don't know if we want to finish up with the other conversation before we get into that. That's up to you, Judge Grace.
Go ahead with your question, because after this, we're going to be moving on to your filing of last week.
Okay. So, Bill, my question is, I guess I'm not understanding how the CCA would be obligated when it doesn't exist yet.
Yeah, that's that's a good question. It would have to, Montgomery County might have to, accept that obligation or something along those lines. Now, if the CCA, didn't come into being, then it would have no load, and the suppliers would just be supplying Pepco SOS, and nothing would change. They wouldn't, the CCA wouldn't get any obligation until it actually came into being.
All right, I guess I need to understand that more, because it sounded more like we were going to be obligated, we being the county and or CCA would be obligated for a certain amount regardless. So you're saying only if that only if people actually move over.
Right. If the wholesale supplier's obligation would be to supply 5%, say, whatever the number is, 5% of the load of the combination of SOS and the CCA. And essentially the CCA would be billed by the utility for that 25% of its load would get billed at the SOS rate. If that's 7 cents per kilowatt hour, then the utility would send the CCA a bill for 5% of its load at 7 cents per kilowatt hour.
Is what you're suggesting, though, basically being decided in April of 22, again, before the CCA exists?
Yeah, well, the price would be, and the obligate, the wholesale supplier's obligation would be, because that's when the wholesale supplier is entering the contract, and the whole point is to have the wholesale supplier understand and know what their obligation is for the whole 24-month period. And that suggestion is a way that potentially could do that. The wholesale suppliers are going to know that their obligation is based on all the customers in Pepco except the ones who sign individual retail supply contracts. That might be a better way to put it. That's which is what the wholesale supplier's obligation is right now. So that would not change. It would be, their obligation would be to supply a certain percentage of all of the customers who are not with an individual retail supply on an individual retail supply contract. Their obligation would be a certain percentage of SOS plus the Montgomery County CCA load.
Right, but you're still anticipating the CCA being obligated to whatever percentage it takes on during that time, being paid to the SOS suppliers.
Yep. Yeah, they'd have to pay money. I'm envisioning it like, that the utility sends the CCA a bill and says, for this month, you had, the CCA served however many, residential customers that it served. They used 1 million kilowatt hours, and we're going to bill you for a quarter of that, 250,000 kilowatt hours at 7 cents. And, the CCA would have to pay that bill. And then, that would cover a quarter of their, that would cover a quarter of the CCA's obligation. When it went out to procure the rest of its power, it wouldn't have to procure that 25%. It would procure the rest of it.
Okay, thank you for explaining that further.
Okay.
Those were my 2 questions, Judge Grace. Thank you.
Judge, I wanted to just follow up a little bit on the limitation on switching. And at one point there was, I think it was folks from PHI. We talked about an EDI vendor, and I'm wondering if if there's been any discussions, if there could be discussions with the EDI vendor to increase the capability there, and maybe that has a cost, but whether that is something that could be discussed.
Yeah, this is Robbie for PHI. I mean, it can be discussed, but I mean, that's the way that it's been for the last several years. Even when we have situations where a third-party supplier is buying a book of customers from another supplier, we still have to limit the amount of transactions that can come in at one time. Otherwise, again, it will have a severe impact on our system.
Okay, thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Any other questions about the joint utilities filing? Okay, moving on to Montgomery County. Montgomery County's filing of last week. Does someone from Montgomery County want to tee it up, or do you want to raise your hands with questions? I know there were a bunch of questions embedded in that filing. Now might be the appropriate time to ask.
Yeah, and this is Lisa Brennan again. So what we were pointing out was, so our last meeting, we talked about what's involved in a staged or a single transition and the pros and cons of each option, the pros and cons of the different start dates. But what we were really hoping for, and I think we're getting some of today, but I'm going to let Stan talk more about whether, he feels we've gotten it all, is the ramifications about the sizes and the timing of those stages. Because like Phil brought up, if BGE has a small number, a small percentage of their customers in Montgomery County, is that what is the ramification of them switching on all at once? We also haven't really talked about whether it makes a difference if the residential or the non-residential start on the same date. If any of the utilities have an opinion about that, we would appreciate it. And if there are different processes that would have to happen for those 2 types of customers or any specific type of customer, that would be helpful. And I'll let Stan, add anything he might want to add from that, or Jason or Adriana if they're on the call.
I don't think I have anything to add, Lisa. We talked about a lot of these issues previously. I still have some questions about that discussion, but nothing that I would add to this.
I just might ask if Montgomery County, this is Taylor Beckham from PHI, excuse me, if Montgomery County has any indications as to when they envision starting the formation of the CCA?
Well, I think, I'm not sure what you mean by that, Taylor, specifically. I mean, I think we're starting that process with these conversations.
I think I'm kind of latching onto the point that Ms. Brennan made in terms of when she was responding to Bill's proposal, you know, in terms of obligating a CCA before it exists. And you know, in considering Bill's proposal, it would be, that was a good point. And so kind of for us, as we're considering these different proposals, I think we'd love to hear from Montgomery County as to when they envision, or when you guys kind of envision getting started with what you all have to get started on.
I guess I would suggest we have a little bit of a chicken and an egg problem here. Because what we have to get started on depends to some extent on the regulations and the process that's being developed here. So I'm not sure I could provide any more definitive answer than that.
Well, and I will add that according to the legislation, Montgomery County can form a community choice aggregator beginning December 31st, 2023. Is that the answer that you're looking for, Taylor?
That's part of it. I think we're just more so so like the earliest that you could form the CCA would be January 1, 2024. I could look at, I don't have the legislation right here.
Yeah, the legislation is Montgomery County can form a community choice aggregator beginning December 31st, 2023. The county's got some things it can do at least 60 days before that, but technically we can't officially form a CCA before December 31st, 2023, which is also the day, you know, that's the honor before date for the regulations.
Right. Okay.
So that's what I think, that's what Stan was saying about the chicken and an egg.
Hey, Lisa, this is David Bloom with BG, and maybe let me ask another level of the question here. So the formation of a entity, the community choice aggregator, does Montgomery County have any vision on the form of what the steps or timing would be for the formation of a community choice aggregation, and then the load service beginning? Sort of what happens in between those two steps? Has Montgomery County begun to shape that period?
We're certainly aware of what the legislation lays out as far as the process to form a CCA, but I don't know. Stan may have started discussing internal discussions on load, but I think that's a little premature.
Yeah, I guess I'm not clear on the question, David.
Yeah, so forming the CCA it's helpful in my view to talk about the formation of the CCA as some sort of entity versus serving the CCA in however way as a load serving entity. That's a PJM term, the load serving entity. And just beginning to, if we can get any kind of vision from Montgomery County on those two distinct steps, and the sort of what happens in between there, that would be helpful, I think. And if you wanted to just accept, you know, okay, let's accept that December 31st, 2023, or even the time the commission needs to adopt the regulations to that deadline, and then even taking our suggestion of October 1st, 2024, if you were to just accept those dates, just a vision of what Montgomery County intends to do during that time.
Yeah, I still don't think I don't think we can answer that question any more definitively than to say we need to follow what's in the law about forming the CCA and then take the necessary steps to become a load-serving entity, as you've described.
Okay, so what I'm walking away with then is that Montgomery County will tell us that during this time of developing the regulations, or will Montgomery County be able to share that, or is Montgomery County intending to wait until after the regulations are accepted or approved by the commission?
Yeah, I can't answer that right now. I'm still unclear about what the specific question is you're asking, and what you want us to tell you.
Lori McGilvray is raising her hand.
Thank you, Judge Grace. I am presuming that the county is not in a position to answer this right now, but along the lines of the formation of the CCA, I'm curious at what point you will need to have a good sense of the SOS transition process schedule load such that you could put together a procurement to become responsible for that load. So I don't know whether the county envisioned a single procurement or tranches like happens with SOS, but they're mirror images of one another. So I'm just curious, since our conversation has focused largely on the transition of load leaving the SOS, I'm wondering what considerations the county has as to the schedule of receiving that load and how that might affect the rate the county can get under the CCA.
Don't think I can answer that either, Lori. I mean, clearly we have to mirror as you say, mirror the transition away from SOS, but we need to have that a little clearer. And then the entity that we retain to procure our load would need to advise us on the pros and cons of different approaches.
So before we go off Montgomery County's filing, can I just ask if any of the utilities could tell us whether there was a difference, whether there's a difference if residential or non-residential start on the same date? Whether those are different processes?
this is David Bloom from BGE, and I don't believe there's a difference, any kind of distinction for switching customers between residential and small commercial. Is that I think that's what the question is, and so I think the answer is no.
Right. I was stuck on mute. Yeah, I agree, David.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no more questions for Montgomery County, we can move on to the filing by staff.
All right, Judge Grace, I'm gonna take a crack at rolling this out, and Dave Hoppick, if you feel the need, jump in to explain anything further, especially when we get to the changes on the bid schedule that we have on the second page there. All right, and if anyone has any questions, go ahead and raise your hand or stop me on the way as we go. Just generally, what we've got here is what staff kind of put together as a plan that we thought would sort of comport with the existing schedules without a whole lot of changes and without any significant alterations to the way SOS is bid, or at least it's sort of constructed in a way that's consistent with the way SOS is bid. So we have sort of our main proposal, and then we've got a couple of options that may serve to modify the proposal or be used in place of it, sort of depending. So it is a single switch proposal. If you look at the general terms of our document there in the middle of the page, it's a single switch that would occur as we're proposing here on October 1 of 24. That is largely being done to avoid having to do anything that would impact the April 22 upcoming bid process. And we talk a little bit later about what we might have to do if that was a desire to start earlier. I think we've identified that it's going to impact the PEPCO bid tranches, and this is a little bit PEPCO centric in terms of how we're thinking of it. But the way it would work essentially would alter the bids that are going to happen in the next, I guess, 3 tranches after this April. So October 22, April 23, October 23, and then do some different things in April of 24. And in order to, I think what we're focusing on is we would like to sort of mitigate significantly any concerns that wholesale bidders would have about what transitioning load to the CCA would do. And that essentially is being kind of done in a fairly blunt manner, which simply ended the contracts such that when the CCA starts up October 1, there is any of the contracts that would be affected by the load transferring would not have obligations for those customers. And I'll talk a little bit about how we're going to kind of cover the load that would otherwise be needed to cover the rest of any residual Montgomery County load, and then what happens going forward. So generally we are truncating the bids, or not so much truncating the existing bids, but rather just bidding for less than 2 years, such that the bids do not impact the transition period. That would allow the transition to occur in October. It would presumably occur for all 3 utilities if we've worked this out correctly. Although there's nothing in particular about the BG&E bid that would require it to do that, because as I note in the sort of last sentence or 2 in the first paragraph, we are making the assumption that the BG&E customer accounts that would be impacted in Montgomery County are, the 10,000 or so, however many, are small enough that we wouldn't be making any changes to the BG&E's process. So, but for ease of customer understanding, we were setting it all on the same date. All right. So what that does is effectively, proposes changes to the bid process. We are also recognizing that by delaying till October 1, we have not only more time, but we also can consider any of the particulars and implementation of this during the summer of 2022, during what would normally be the standard procurement improvement process for SOS. And we thought that has a lot of advantages in that we have more time, and then all of the normal folks that are expecting to participate in that wouldn't be having to do that off cycle. So we kind of thought that that would be generally helpful. All right, advantages and disadvantages. So we think the single stage, I think we're in agreement that doing it sort of at one shot helps all the customers understand, what's happening and eliminates any confusion. Although I think we have, some sympathy for the concept that if there was a way to easily explain to customers how they're in Montgomery County, but perhaps like in the BG&E service territory or in the Pepco service territory, or if there's some way to otherwise make it easy to distinguish the customers so they sort of know, oh, I live in this particular zip code, or I live in, a particular municipality within Montgomery County, I'm switching on this date. There was some way to manage that. But just for the purpose of simplicity, one-time switching happening all at the same time. Choosing October, aside from the fact that it coincides with the end of the summer rate period for some, and is normally when you would expect to see a price change. So that might help with customers sort of not being surprised by things. We also were considering that in October, there is normally in Maryland, depending, I guess, where you are in Maryland, but there's normally a much lower energy consumption because you are between the heating and cooling seasons. So the switching on a shoulder month, as they call it, if there are any significant increases in price due to the market at the time or the composition, perhaps having additional expense associated with renewable products or something like that, that might not cause as much of a sort of rate shock for customers. So we kind of thought that might be helpful in that regard. The I think we mentioned the PIP process using the October time period, although it's a little bit, it's a couple of months after the CCA may have formed, depending on when folks believe is the kind of, if there's a legislative deadline that would allow for the CCA to start. I think the pilot has a start date that's built in there that might be April 1 of some kind. But we also recognize that there is a 2-year transition period that's allowed by the legislation. And so, whether or not shifting the actual enrollment date to a later period during that 2 years, we're shifting to October is still within that. So it didn't appear to conflict with the language of the legislation. We sort of hope that this would require minimal changes to the bidding process by not necessarily creating any uncertainty about whether or not the amount of load that would be serving would change during the course of the term of the contracts. And then it would hopefully provide some additional certainty that we were trying to, I think everybody agrees is helpful to have. So, downsides, obviously it's going to take a little bit longer to get it started, although, maybe it's not that much longer depending on, it might be a more opportune time to conduct, a large scale switching of energy supply. The means we tried to kind of come up with a way that reflects what happens after the transition. And I don't know if I don't think we talked about that. I don't think that was part of what the utilities considered, but we hope that by the spring of 2024, there will be a lot more known about the prices that the CCA will be charging customers, the number of customers that are expected to switch either by opting for it or by just being switched by default and anything else. So recognizing that there would be still a continual need for residual SOS service in Montgomery County, we're proposing to simply bid that on a quarterly basis. I believe starting with April of 2024. Now, there are probably concerns about that. Quarterly bids are going to create prices that can move around, and whether or not it moves, in a detrimental way or a beneficial one, it's kind of hard to tell at this point. We are proposing with this sort of, I guess, our preferred method, if you want to call it that, that the SOS price for both Prince George's and Montgomery County is combined. So there would not be separate prices. So any volatility that would be picked up by bidding for residual load in Montgomery County would be reflected in the rates that would be paid for by all SOS customers. So the expectation, I think, is that the amount of residual load is expected to be relatively small, and so that wouldn't necessarily, unduly impact the stability that's expected from standard offer service. But again, that's sort of, it's not quite up in the air, but it's definitely not something we have entirely a firm idea about until we see what the CCA is going to, how much load they're going to take on, what the prices will be, that sort of thing. So that's a little bit of a concern, is that the SOS load, or the price for SOS, is going to have some fluctuations that are going to be caused by mixing the SOS load for the residual load from Montgomery County bid quarterly with any load that, or the Prince George's County load, which would still continue to be bid in the way that we've traditionally done so. All right. And I think, unless there are some other questions, I'm going to skip over the changes to the bid that we have here, and maybe there may be some questions if we need to get into that, and I'll ask Dave to kind of pick up on some of that. And let me just jump down to the alternate methods that we talked about, and I'll pause here if there's any questions that folks want to jump into, but it might be helpful if we just sort of continue with the entire presentation. So first alternate method is really just shifting the date earlier. And this gives up the opportunity to use the standard PIP process to kind of solve this problem or address it. And it means that, there's a couple of ways that we could probably try to do this and achieve results that were effective for the April 22 bid. That might mean simply, seeing if it's possible to conduct a portion or all of the PIP process, making it either an adjustment that addressed specifically the April bid, or attempting to sort of start the PIP process for 22 in January rather than waiting until the summer, and maybe sort of attempting to do that more kind of broadly or globally, covering beyond just the April. But for sure, if there's any desire to start June 1st of 24, that means we have to change the April bids. And so, getting a path to that means really finding out from the folks that normally participate in the PIP process, many of whom are probably represented at least with their organizations in our working group, but we don't have access to, or I don't know, we deliberately tried to reach out to the folks that participate from the wholesale bid side of the PIP process. Although I think staff is sort of maybe thinking about reaching out to that working group list and having some discussions kind of in the very near term to see what can be arranged for the first couple of weeks of 22 to see if there's an opportunity. So I recognize that we recognize that we're sort of putting that up there if there is a very strong desire and from, I guess in particular, from Montgomery County or the other folks and stakeholders in the working group that really want to see this start as early as possible. And if we're trying to avoid getting into a situation where we're sort of attempting to interpret the legislative requirements for when this can start, seeing if there's at least some opportunity to talk about what we would have to do if we need to make adjustments to this April 22 bid that's coming up. All right. So number 2 here is really sort of a modification of our proposal, kind of from our I just talked about. This would and I think maybe Bill mentioned this a little bit, if we formally separate Prince George's County's load from Montgomery County's load, the thought there is there's still going to be enough load in Prince George's County to conduct an effective bid. That's an assumption that, you know, it would still be a very large number of customers, probably bigger than Delmarva, and not sure if it's bigger than Potomac Edison, but it still might be big enough that Prince George's could be sort of separated from Montgomery County. I think that would probably leave the Montgomery County blocks to be a very small amount of load, possibly, and maybe it wouldn't go through that quarterly bid process. Maybe the utility would supply that that load, you know, through the same process that the utility would use if the increment decrement was tripped and they had to go into the market. Now, you know, that's a lot more volatile, possibly, but it also might reflect prices that, you know, don't have a significant premium, and to the extent the energy markets were more stable, that and given the fact that there'd be a CCA in Montgomery County as an option, maybe that's not a bad thing. But that would sort of probably require something that might have to be done after considerable amount of discussion in the 9064 case, and you know, I don't know that that's a simple thing to do, but that might be a way at some point long term to sort of formally insulate Prince George's County from any price impacts caused by changes to the Montgomery County process. And then the third method, I think Bill's already talked about this a little bit, and we have not, I think, really had any sort of opportunity to sort of figure out by looking at like the terms of the firm service agreement or the SOS contract, determine whether or not this is something that can be done with those contracts, or if the contract needs to be altered, or the terms of standard offer service. And then obviously the utilities would have to be sort of part of that process, so we'd need to have some discussions there. But we were also thinking along the lines of, if we were unable to reach any sort of agreement at this point, is this an option that allows the SOS bids to continue going forward without changes, even if there is not a like a clear sort of agreement from all the parties in the working group that we could, in fact, you know, get a commitment that the CCA would begin at a particular point. So that's probably something that has a lot more discussion that needs to be done on it. But you know, that might be an outside the box approach that if we're unable to reach a consensus here about what to do next, we should probably sit down and spend a lot of time talking about. And the one thing before I finish up, I might sort of add here, we have not had the benefit of having a discussion with retail suppliers or other folks who have participated in CCA transitions in some of the other jurisdictions throughout the country that have done this. And I don't know if we've picked up on all of the options that are available or feasible, or if any of these things that we've mentioned thus far have a similarity to what's been done before. But that certainly might be a something that we would want to do as soon as we possibly can to make sure that if there are other pitfalls we haven't seen yet, or if there's a smoother way that's already been done, we could learn about that. So I would certainly encourage our stakeholders that are familiar with that from the retail supply side to, if they're able to provide anything to the working group, anecdotally or otherwise, about what's been done elsewhere in a manner that might work for us. The sooner we know about that, the better. So, and with that, Dave, did you want to add anything in particular about the bid changes, or do we want to just see if folks have specific questions about that?
I can describe them briefly. So, Judge Grace, if you kind of go back to the second page, you can share that screen again. Yeah. Scroll down just a little bit, please. Yep, there's good. So when we were looking at the PEPCO data that Pepco provided on Montgomery County customer counts, Montgomery County load for SOS for Montgomery County versus all of Pepco's service territory. It looks like Montgomery County represents about 53% of Pepco's residential SOS load, both from a sales perspective and a number of customer perspective. So, we took that as approximately half the block's bid can be thought of as needed to serve Montgomery County load. So in terms of kind of ideas for the PIP process to consider would be for October, for half of that load, because the bids would serve load through October 2024. For half of that load bid in October 2024, the contracts would end early. So you would remove the last 8 months. And so effectively, the 2-year bids are for the Prince George's County load, and then the Montgomery County load is bid through October 2024. And we have the same thing for April 2023 and October 2023, where we're truncating half the bids such that they serve a period through October 2024. And then from April 2024 on, you're really bidding the Prince George's County load, and then that residual load, we are going to have presumably some Montgomery County customers who choose to stay with SOS, or who, for whatever reason, migrate back. Again, you would meet that load with the quarterly bids, and part of the thinking behind the quarterly bids is that we'll hopefully have a fair amount more information, as Phil described. So you'd hopefully have a lot better idea, okay, how much SOS load for Montgomery County is residual. And then meet that part, because obviously Montgomery County load SOS load is not going to 100% go away, but use that quarterly process and the information we gain over time to meet that load. And then below that for PE, again, reviewing the data PE provided, it looks like Montgomery County is about 13% of PE load, and PE procures 15 blocks to meet residential SOS. So 2 out of 15 is approximately 13%. So we're thinking for, again, for consideration by the PIP process, for loads from October on, they would, for 2 out of those 15 bids, they would be truncated. And then we'd have that same process for April 2024 on for the residual Montgomery County bid. If you looked up earlier in our proposal, we did propose a deferral of the bids in the upcoming June and April bids that go through 2024, to defer those to the October 2024 bid, such that we can discuss those in the PIP process. So with that, open it up for questions.
And if I just, one more
Hey,
thing
Dave,
before we pick that up, I was gonna say, we're still thinking that something needs to go to the commission to confirm one way or the other what's happening, in order to clarify if there's gonna be any changes to the April bid.
Yeah, agreed.
Bill Fields is the first person who has his hand raised.
Thank you, Judge. Well, I mean, first a comment. I appreciate this, staff. I did get ahead of you a little bit with the 2 alternate suggestions. but this was very helpful. On the, I mean, a comment is I have a real concern, a significant concern about changing the Pepco SOS procurement, because you're changing the procurement for Prince George's County customers who are not part of this at all. And those changes may result in lower prices, may result in higher prices. There's no way to know at this point. But you're putting a risk on them. I would like to, I think we should try to find a way to do this without doing that. But I did have a question about this, the residual load. I think I'm having a trouble understanding where the residual load comes from, because the SOS procurement, all those little percentages, they add up to 100%. And so there's no, all of SOS load is covered and none is uncovered. So I guess I'm having trouble seeing where does the residual load come from.
So Bill, I think the way we're thinking about it is it after October 2024, it adds up to 100% of the PG County SOS load. And then we separate the Montgomery County customers who choose for whatever reason to remain on SOS. And then we use those quarterly bids to meet their load. And I think part of the thought is that there's, there potentially you have, very few people initially who say, no, I want to stay on SOS. And then for whatever reason, 2-3 months in, there's a decent migration. Then you have another quarterly bid where you can use that information and you essentially bid to meet more load. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. So you would effectively, I mean, you would at that point have separated out Prince George's County SOS from Montgomery County SOS.
You'd have separated it out in the bid process.
Oh, right. Okay.
We are thinking in terms of pricing, it's still all combined to provide a single Pepco residential SOS price. And, if there are, the shifts in costs that need to be recovered through the true-up mechanism, those are recovered through the true-up mechanism.
Okay. Yeah, that's helpful. I understand that. I think we'd still have that concern. I mean, obviously that, means that the Prince George's County prices are impacted by what happens with procuring that Montgomery County load. Could be higher, could be lower, but it's going to impact them. I think you raised a good question there about how many customers bounce back after a few months. Regardless of the quality of the communication, there's always going to be a number of people who, have no idea about this until they actually see it on their bill. And then, there could be some migration, maybe significant migration back, trying to go back to an SOS after a few months. Might depend on what the prices are like. Anyway, I think that's all my questions. Like I said, I think this is creative, but but I think it has that major concern for us that you're impacting the Prince George's County customers, and the way to avoid that is alternate one alternate two or alternate three that you're talking about. Okay, thanks.
Bill, could I ask the question, do you see that if we were to separate the Montgomery County customers and they would face a different price than the Prince George's County customers. I think that may be what you're suggesting. You know, any residual load from Montgomery County, we really don't have a way to bid that using the 2-year process that, you know, really stabilizes those bids. So do you have a concern as well regarding the SOS price that the Montgomery County customers might be facing?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. You still do have to deal with that. And, you know, maybe a type 2. I mean, we're still thinking about that part of the problem. Maybe the type 2 quarterly type of bid is the best approach. I mean, it's kind of you know, it's a problem. It's an issue however you do it. Maybe that's the best approach, or maybe, you know, maybe some kind of a yearly, you know, a year-long contracts that are laddered could still be workable, you know, in the market. Even though, you know, it's a little unclear, you know, there would be obviously a lot of uncertainty about those, you know, what the load was there. But it could be, I mean, another possibility to think about is to include that, what you're calling residual load, you know, include just that in the procurement for, along with the Prince George's County SOS. You know, those customers are being procured together now, with obviously all of Montgomery County, all of Prince George's County SOS. You know, perhaps including, you know, the Montgomery County opt-out customers in with Prince George's County, you know, the PEPCO SOS. Maybe that's the best way to go.
And do you mean once it's stabilized, or are you suggesting that we would attempt to guess what that level would be now and bid a little bit more?
Well, I don't think you'd have to. I don't think you'd have to guess. I mean,
well, in April 22, you'd be guessing, right?
Well, the suppliers would be guessing. That's the point. You making it the supplier's obligation, and they'd have to make a guess at, you know, how many Montgomery County customers were going to stay. We're going to end up back with the SOS. You know,
but wouldn't that be just not changing the bid schedule and letting it sort of cards fall where they may? In other words, if we didn't change the April 22 and just said, you guys are going to lose probably half the load, but we're not sure how much of it, so bid accordingly.
No, I think there's a separate issue in there. I mean, if we don't change anything, we just say, hey, you know, wholesale suppliers, Montgomery County might leave. You know, if they do, they do. If they don't, they don't. You know, deal with it, and we get a price. I think it's a separate issue to say, you know, we want to deal with the Montgomery County leaving, but that the you know, the Montgomery County customers who stay in SOS could still be part of that procurement, even, you know, but find a way that the wholesale suppliers don't have the you know, are assured that they're not going to, that they're going to know what their obligation is for the CCA customers. And I think that's where you really get into the, you know, that once the contract starts for Montgomery County customers, you know, Montgomery County customers have to stick with that contract until the end of it. You know, what you're talking about in number 3. I think what I'm trying to say is you could do number 3 and have the individual customers who stay with PEPCO SOS, they could stay in a joint PEPCO SOS.
Oh, I see. So you're if we were to develop a means by which the CCA would assume any unused SOS energy for the CCA. As the CCA needed less, SOS would need more, presumably, and then it would sort of self-correct.
I'm not sure if I followed that.
I guess I was trying to sort out how you were. So you were suggesting that the SOS price would be the same for any residual Montgomery County load and the Prince George's County load, but we would be sort of, rather than using a quarterly bid, using the expected, next quarter's residual Montgomery County load, you would simply let the SOS bidders at some point understand that to the extent that the residual load was non-zero, they'd be responsible for picking it up. And then if it dropped back, it would just be kind of an increment decrement for where they would have to sort of estimate what the net load would be with whatever information they had about the level of the CCA enrollment for the time in question. And
yeah, I don't think it's even that complicated. I mean, you'd be saying to the SOS suppliers, the residual Montgomery County customers are going to be part of Pepco SOS, and that's part of what you're bidding on.
But we would be making that change to sort of express that to them as early as April of 22 in order to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because if they're if Montgomery County might leave during that contract, you have to have the rules in place, April of 2022. I suppose. I mean, and the bidding is in April 2022, just because it seems like 6 months between the bid and the start of the contract is a kind of a reasonable lead time.
All right. I guess what I need to understand a little bit more about how that solution would work is, at what point would the CCA, after it's established, begin sort of taking, providing its own portion of the load based on its own procurement process, and like how that it would be like a transition of its own as that happened, rather than a transition. It would be a transition of the load of the procurement, that the CCA would take over more and more of what would have been previously provided through an SOS contract, that you're modifying to sort of to be assumed by the CCA in the event that it doesn't have its own load in place. So it's like
you're talking about number 3.
Yeah, I thought that's what you were talking about.
Yeah, I was talking about number 3. I mean, the the way I envision number 3 working is, in April, we say, for those the wholesale suppliers bidding in April, we say, you are getting X% of the combination of Pepco SOS and the CCA load, and through the whole contract. And so for the wholesale suppliers, then it doesn't matter how many customers are on, the CCA and how many are on the SOS, because they have a percentage of them either way. So that doesn't matter. You would have to now the CCA, say it starts June 1st of 2024. Starting June 1st of 2024, the CCA would have to procure 75% of the supply for however many customers it has, and it would have to figure out how to do that. Which it could use a full requirements contracts, that add up to that 75%. It could do it various ways. They would have 75% from June 1 through September 30, and then as of October 1, then they would have 100%. Now that's they'd have to provide 100% of the load. Now that's assuming that, we only did this number 3 approach for the April auction. And then we sort of, we were, had some other approach, or, had sorted some things out by October, this coming October 2022.
So, Bill, your folks are thinking you might be able to sort of put that on paper at some point in the near future and sort of lay out how that would work and get it back to us.
Yeah, I can try to send something around, this week.
Okay.
It won't have all of the, I'm sure it's not going to be able to answer every question, but.
Okay, Stan Edwards has his hand raised. And then after that, Phil, I have a couple of questions.
Okay.
Thank you. Phil, just a quick question about alternate number 2.
Yes.
Do you know of downsides to Prince George's County customers to do this?
So if you were to, I mean, there's probably things that we haven't thought about, but the amount of load would be smaller, and might be less attractive to bidders if it's smaller. Hard to say. It would still be a lot of load, and as I mentioned earlier, I think we think it's maybe even bigger than Delmarva in terms of number of accounts that are being served, and maybe on par with Potomac Edison's. I think there may be some other things that we haven't thought of, but it was really just the desire to, well, what if we completely isolate the bidding? It would appear, aside from bidding a smaller load, to be nearly identical to what's being, the process by which the Pepco loads bid now. Possibly there's costs to Pepco that have to get understood. That might, create some additional things that would show up in cost recovery for the admin charge for both, for all the SOS load or something else of that nature. But strictly I don't think we've identified. There may be other things that are more risky, but I don't think we identified anything specific other than smaller load.
And I guess the smaller load would occur regardless, right?
Yeah. Yeah, this is Bill. Yeah, Stan, I think that's right. I mean, it would be a smaller load, but like at the beginning when you did this, say in April, if Pepco was going out to procure both the PG County side and the Montgomery County side on the same day, I'm not sure that it's it really would act like less load. I mean, the same number of blocks would be available to the suppliers in general, and the way it works now, they bid block by block. So you put a bid and try to win as many blocks. They presumably try to win as many blocks as they can. If you did it this way, they'd be bidding for the PG County blocks and the Montgomery County blocks separately, but combined it would still be the same number of blocks. So there's as much business available on that day as there was the way it works now. And then, like you were saying, as you went into the future and PG County SOS was on its own, it's going to be smaller anyway. We can't do anything about that.
Yeah, this option at first blush is appealing to me, just because one of the things, as I've said, it's certainly not our desire to negatively impact Prince George's County customers. So to the extent this can help isolate that as much as possible, that's appealing. But
I think the other concern that Montgomery County might want to very carefully look at is if there are folks that stay on SOS, that has to be bid separate from Prince George's County.
Yeah.
It might be very small and possibly, it's bid at, prevailing market prices, the way the utilities bid something like the large commercial hourly prices that aren't bid using bids at all, that are acquired through the energy market. So I mean, there certainly would be more volatile, and it could be very small. So
yeah,
Montgomery County customers could experience is SOS prices that fluctuate a lot.
Yeah, and I get
how much, but
yeah.
But you do have a CCA. I guess you could put them on. So I don't know where that goes in terms of
Yeah, I was going to say, maybe that gives us even greater incentive to make sure we're getting good prices for the CCA. But yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you, Phil.
So Phil, I appreciate staff's ideas on, you know, how the PIP folks could change the SOS bid process. I'm looking at the statute right now, and at the conclusion of the pilot in 2031 or 2032, the commission has to study whether there were any incremental costs borne by SOS customers resulting from the migration of customers between the CCA and standard offer service, and what mechanisms could be implemented to hold SOS customers harmless. But I'm not certain that the changes to the SOS process are something that need to be determined in our forum. I'm really wary of the fact that we don't have all of the stakeholders that they have, for instance, in the PIP process in 9064. I know that there's a regularly scheduled hearing in PIP on January 13th, but the proposals, the only two proposals that we have at this point are from staff and from the utilities, right? And both of those seem pretty complementary to each other. So if we were able to get to the commission and say, hey, make a filing that says, hey, we're not going to be starting in June of 2024. We're going to be starting in October of 2024, and say, for instance, you can expect 10,000 customers, 5,000 PEPCO, and 5,000 BGE customers to be transferred daily. You know, a little more detail on that. And then PE customers would start to transfer, what they say, June 1st of 2025 at 10,000 customers a day. Then we wouldn't, correct me if I'm wrong, we wouldn't need to make decisions on what we would be recommending to the commission for changes to the PIP process. And while we could, you know, have off-week meetings on that in this forum and make a suggestion to the commission by filing in 9064, I'm not sure that that's something that we would need to address now. Am I right?
Let me just, yeah, I think generally, yes. I think it would be helpful to, if we've reached some sort of an agreement that we would be starting in October rather than June of 2024, it might be helpful to let, like, the, you know, the commission know that, and thus the folks involved in the wholesale side of the procurement know that, so they will be clear that they, you know, what they're bidding in April is not going to be affected by this. So that probably still means getting to the commission saying, we need you to, you know, we either need you to confirm, approve, or decide that the CCA is not going to start switching customers until October 1 of 2024. And if you do so, it appears to us that there will be no impact to this upcoming bid, and that we will take this up during the PIP process in the summer of 22. So I think it would be helpful to clarify that for everyone, and then maybe the bidders, you know, don't have any issues to worry about for the upcoming bid. I think if we say nothing and don't do anything, there might be some, you know, there might be folks thinking, well, I'm not sure, they may come back and change this, so I'm going to bid accordingly anyhow.
Right, saying nothing's not an option. I'm just wondering if we need to go into this much detail, especially since we don't have all of the players necessary to you know, have a full picture.
In terms of the alterations to the bid itself?
Yes.
Yeah, I think we don't need to decide that, but I think we need to probably let folks begin to have an understanding of what that would look like, because ultimately we would be suggesting something like this to the PIP process, and then they would make the final decision. But I think the only decision at this point is if there's a consensus from the group that starting, you know, at least PEPCO and Potomac Edison no earlier than October 1, we need to decide that and then get the commission to approve it, so that it's clear for the upcoming bid that won't affect it. But we don't have to work out all the details because there may be other things that need to get dealt with. But this just gives us time. If folks agree to October 1, it gives much more time and allows the PIP process to be used under its normal schedule. I don't know if
I see Stan Edwards is raising his hand again.
Yeah, thank you, Judge Grace. I guess what I'm hoping is that, that we have a lot of innovative people on this work group, and rather than say we're deciding on a start date, we could say we're not going to affect the April 2022 bid, and then go through the PIP process and perhaps have something that, again, allows some earlier start than October 1, recognizing that there's a lot of issues that need to be worked out. But I guess I'm just asking whether that decision needs to be made now, or whether it's the issue about, are we affecting the April 22 bid? Is the real
Any non-decision affects the April 2022 bid.
Well, Stan, this is Bill Fields. Perhaps a way to say that would be that, the aggregation would not start before October 1, 2024, unless there was a PIP process that devised a way to allow that to happen earlier without affecting the April procurement. Now that would mean that there would have to be some PIP discussions, but you could maybe phrase it that way.
I'm not so sure from the utility perspective. I hear what you're saying, Bill, but I think the fact that we chose the October 1 start date is directly related to not affecting the April 2022 bid. So any start, whether it's conditioned or not, prior to October 1st, 2024, in PE's case, June 1, 2025, will affect the April 22 bid. So I think
yeah, I agree with
Go
you.
ahead.
I mean, there would have to be some changes adopted by the commission prior to April 2022, in order to, so that it wouldn't be affected negatively for, Prince George's County customers, at least, or I should say other SOS customers.
Heard, and I think those changes, though, and I'm picking up on what Judge Grace is saying, would possibly be needed to be made in another docket.
Oh yeah, they'd have to, right, they'd have to come through the PIP process in 9064. Yeah, I was just trying to, suggest if Montgomery County was hesitant to say, we're definitely not starting before October 1, 2024, there would be that avenue, to say, well, it's not going to start before 2024 unless the commission adopts changes to the SOS procurement that deals with this risk issue prior to April of 2022.
I hear your point. I hear you.
This is Jorge. I have a point of clarification for Judge Grace. Then, are you feeling, you say that a non-decision is not an option? Are you though saying it needs to happen like in the next 5 minutes, or is this like, do we have time going into January? Because it seemed like Bill Fields from the Public Counsel Office of Public Counsel also introduced some ideas in here, but we haven't seen them written out, and I understand it was because of capacity. But yeah, question for you, Judge Grace, is that how you're thinking about it?
This will need to be a decision that's made at the next meeting in 2 weeks.
That's helpful.
Essentially, at the bare minimum, we have to have a letter to the commission prior to, that all the parties can consider in the PIP process prior to the PIP hearing. Commission doesn't like to get a filing, the night before or a few days before. So this would need to be a decision that we make in 2 weeks, and then I would need to get a letter to the commission regarding the decision, very, 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 very early in January, like first, second, third. I'm not looking at a calendar right now.
And just the decision, I think, because there's multiple things being flown out here. Is there a way we can narrow our scope a little bit? Is it decision just about whether we'll start October 1st?
Okay, well, the proposal that we have right now with staff and the joint utilities, they seem pretty complimentary. The proposal is to have a one-time start pretty much for each of the utilities, and for Petco and BGE to start on October 1st, 2024, and for Potomac Edison to start on June 1st, 2025. There's more detail that we would need to provide regarding how quickly that switch would happen with computer limitations. But I'll ask right now, if there are any objections to that start date and that proposal, that combined proposal of staff and the utilities, please raise your hand, state your specific objection and what your alternative proposal is.
Judge Grace, I understood you to say we'd have to make that decision by the next meeting.
Well, I'm asking if there's any objection to that at this point.
I would like to give you that answer at the next meeting.
And I think Jorge Aguilar has raised his hand.
I mean, it's just I do think they are significantly different. I think you're characterizing them as similar. So
Okay, well,
and so from what I've heard from the county, I believe was that there was some decoupling between just the April auction and or setting a date. But that's and then I heard the OPC also offer some ideas, again, not in front of me right now, which you're not including in there, Judge. So again, I am a little bit uncertain about this, honestly. But I don't know if it's an objection as much as it is a clarification from what you're saying or stating.
okay, noted. Ms. McGilvray?
Yes, thank you, Judge Grace. My reservation really extends to the June 2025 date for Potomac Edison because it's 7 months after the October 2024 date. And I feel like that raises a real equity issue for Montgomery County residents. So I would like to have further conversation and explore what options. I don't feel like we've done that sufficiently for Potomac Edison's particular approach, such that there may be a way to advance that June 2025 date to begin to bring some Montgomery County residents on sooner.
Thank you. Bill Fields, hand is raised.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Judge. I guess if Montgomery County is comes back and says it's acceptable to start October 1, 2024, or in 2025 for PE zone, or although I certainly understand that's a different time. I think that would be, that's an acceptable solution to OPC to get us, past the April 2022. I think we do have concerns, though, with some of what staff has laid out in terms of altering the procurement, although that doesn't kick in until April 20. I'm sorry. that doesn't kick in until October 2022. So I don't think we need to, come to any resolution on that, before you send your letter. The letter is just going to say, hopefully the letter can say that, it's not, that the April 22 is, they're down an issue for April 22. So I just don't want to say that we're on board with everything that staff has in there as far as changing the PIP process. If Montgomery County is, not able to agree to that, it's going to be, they'll have to be, I guess the alternatives are either the commission imposes that solution, or they set up a process to, try to continue to come up with ideas or resolutions, prior to the April procurement. And people could file before the commission on that or something. It's a little hard for me to tell, where we would go after that.
Correct. Bill, do you agree that it's necessary to have the input of the stakeholders in 9064 for the commission to make a decision on changes in the SOS process?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I think if the answer is anything other than, our group here has decided on these dates, that the CCA is not going to start before these dates. If the answer is anything other than that, then yeah, I think you have to go through, then the only way to deal with the problem is to change the April procurement, and you have to go through a PIP process and make a filing in 9064 to do that. So the recommendation might just be to the commission that, we weren't able to resolve the April 2022 issue. We don't have we can't say that it won't start before October 2024, and therefore, there needs to be consideration in the PIP process for changing the April procurement, and that has to be done, very quickly.
Thank you. Taylor Beckham has raised her hand.
Yep, I'll just go really quickly. I know it's 4:03. I just want to make sure that the utilities position is clear, because I think there's just a fine point here. Our proposal and our position is aligned with staff primarily only on the start date. I think we do have concerns with the other items in their proposal. As Bill Field said, the changes to the PIP process, we're not aligned on that, but it's start date only on the utility side.
Yes, I'm setting aside entirely. We don't have the stakeholders necessary. We've only begun this discussion. And it's not part of our mandate. So I'm setting aside, sorry, staff, it was really illustrative, but I'm setting aside the proposals from staff about the specific changes to the PIP/SOS process. But what I'm asking is, today is December the 14th. We have a meeting on December the 28th. We'll be coming to a decision on that meeting. So no later than Wednesday, December 22nd, please make a filing with the rest of the members of the working group about your position. If you have an objection to the proposal, the combined proposal of staff and the joint utilities on start date and start mechanism only, please state your objection and state your alternative proposal, and make that in a filing no later than December 22nd. So everybody has a chance to take a look at it. And then we'll discuss it on December the 28th. Does anyone else have anything to say? Bill?
Yes, thank you, Judge. Just to clarify, the two ideas that I threw out earlier in the call, they really line up with staff's alternates 2 and 3. I could send something around to flesh that out, but they're really, really PIP issues.
That still would be really useful, Bill.
Okay, I mean, it'll just be a modest fleshing out of 2 and 3. But just to be clear, those are really PIP issues that would, if that discussion or when that discussion happens, those are 2 ideas to be out on the table. I'll try to make that clear.
Thank you. Lisa Brennan.
Sorry, we've gone back and forth on this a couple of times. I just want to make sure I understand the final ask from us. Is it not starting before October 1st, 2024, so as not to impact the April 22 auction? Or is it also agreeing with a later June 1st, 2025 start date for Potomac Edison?
It's both, but if the October, if just getting to the commission the information that we're not going to impact the April auction, that we're not going to start before October of 2022, that basic information would be sufficient as a fallback position, but we need to discuss the full proposals that are in front of us, and those include the proposals by the joint utilities and PE that they don't feel like they can, because PE's bid is different and it goes out further. So that start date proposed by PE is the same restriction that BGE and the PHI customers, that's the reason why they suggested October. It's the same reasoning why PE has suggested the start date that they have suggested. So it's the, to your question, it's the first, whether there is agreement to the proposal for all 3 companies, the joint proposal of staff and the joint utilities. And as a fallback, we can discuss something lesser.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Judge, are you just then effectively saying, do we agree with the utilities proposal? Is that a way to summarize it better? Because it is different than the staff one. And the PSC
As regards to the start date, staff, do you feel like your proposal as to the start date and mechanism is different significantly from or different at all from that of the joint utilities?
Your Honor, the April bid would have to change. There'd be the April and the June tranche for PE have contracts that would have to move to October in order for them all to start October 1. So if we don't make any changes to PE's bid schedule for April and for June of this year, then I think that's what creates the June of 25 start date.
So what is staff's position on the proposal by the joint utilities?
We are, I think we're suggesting that we could make a change to the April 22 bid and the June 22 bid that simply deferred bidding those tranches so that they wouldn't cause a problem and would allow the start to occur earlier. We did not really have an opportunity to discuss that with the company directly, but it seemed one way to work out a start date that was common to all 3 companies, understanding that it does require PE to make a move with the April bid, and it doesn't require the others to do that.
If I could jump in, Judge Phil or Dave Hoppick, if you made that shift, if you shifted those to be bid in October, what are the contract start and stop dates for the contracts that you'd be shifting?
Dave, do you know that? I don't have that right in front of me.
Yeah, so we were working off of a schedule given to us by Potomac Edison, and based on something I think Rob said earlier, or Bob, I may have misinterpreted a little bit, but according to the schedule that I was working off of, in April, there's 3 blocks. 2 of those blocks serve a contract from June 2023 through May 2024. One of those serves a block, serves between June 2024 and April 2025. So we were thinking that one block would be pushed to be bid in October. And then also for June, looking at the schedule, it looks like there's 2 blocks that are served June 2023 through May 2024, and then 1 block that serves June 2024 through May 2025. And again, it would be that single block that would be pushed towards October. So I think we might need to have a conversation offline with PE about that, but that is what we were envisioning. Did that answer your question, Bill?
I think so. What I was really trying to get at was, you'd be bidding some contracts in October, and those contracts would start the earliest they would start would be June. That's the idea?
June 2024.
2020 or 2023.
2024, not 2023.
Oh, I see. Okay. Well, that's still a good, I was trying to think about the lead time you'd have before, when you bid in October 2022. It seems like you'd still have significant lead time.
Yeah, based on our understanding of the PE schedule.
All right, thanks.
So to answer Jorge Aguilar's question, we may, for instance, see a filing from staff reacting to the joint utilities proposal. We may, for instance, see a filing from Potomac Edison reacting to staff's proposal to change its SOS bidding prior to the April bid. We may see a filing from Montgomery County indicating that they want to continue to push for a start date in June for across the utilities. Who knows? But you have 2 proposals in front of you, and it would be useful to find out what each party, if each party has an objection to either one of those proposals, but what specifically that objection is, and specifically what an alternative proposal is. Does that answer your question?
Got it. Yeah, so they are different. They're not, yes, got it.
Your Honor, this is Bill Fields again. What was that? What day are you looking for those filing?
Next Wednesday, December the 22nd. Essentially, right now we're looking at meetings every other week, and we're going to be looking at filings on the Wednesday of the off week. So that gives folks an opportunity to review and ruminate over and decide a position for discussion prior to the next meeting, as opposed to, sending something the same morning. It just doesn't give folks the opportunity to think about the opposing positions. And while we're on this subject, I should say, each time I send out an email, it's a new and updated list. So if you want to make sure to include all parties, some folks didn't get some of the filings this last week. If you want to make sure you include all of the parties, cut and paste from my most recent email. I sent one out this morning with regards to the delivery of your comments to everyone in this working group.
Judge, this is Bill Fields again. Could I make just a request on the filing date?
Yes.
If we were to file by noon on the 22nd, that would give us an extra afternoon to consider and ruminate, considering the holiday coming up.
Great.
Would just give a little more lead time there.
That's a great suggestion, Bill. Noon on December 22nd, 12/22 at 12. Anyone else have anything before we close the meeting today? Okay, thank you everyone for your participation today and your ideas, and I look forward to seeing your additional information that you file on December the 22nd by noon.
Hey, Judge, when would be the next meeting? When would the next
December the
meeting?
28th at 1 o'clock.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice day, everyone.
All right, thank you, Your Honor.
Thank you as well.